Hi everyone, this is Owen from Primal RC, and today I'm going to be showing you how to take our V3 shocks from the monster truck and install the V3 negative pressure reservoirs. These new reservoirs are actually functional. There's a screw here so you can adjust the dampening on the fly, and you can adjust how stiff the shock feels basically. It uses the same oil from the shock, and then there's a passageway along the top of the shock cap to go into the reservoir here. To demonstrate the effect of these shocks, I can show you on our test truck here. So we have the reservoirs installed. Right now the screws on the reservoir are backed out all the way, so they're just flush on the end here. And if I give the truck some push and pull, you can see how easy it is to move in the entire travel of the shock. Now I'll go in and tighten these screws up all the way, which will push the piston up, add more pressure, and I'll show you the effect it has on the handling. So now with the screw tightened fully, you can see it's much harder to move the truck up and down, and the travel actually doesn't go all the way to the bottom because we've pushed some oil out of the reservoir and into the shock. So it doesn't have the full travel and is much stiffer. This would be good if you're doing speed runs, or let's say you're jumping the truck a lot. You'll want that stiff suspension. On the other hand, you can back these screws all the way out like I did in the beginning, and you'll have a really fast moving suspension that's very smooth, and that might be good for rock crawling or going through the woods over obstacles. This new kit will only work with the V3 shocks that have the 10mm shaft, because we also changed the shock cap, so this V3 shock cap is the same on the V3 reservoir. So now we can get started installing this kit. We also offer this kit in blue if you want to match your blue shocks on your truck. Each kit comes with everything you need to put reservoirs on 2 shocks. And so for example, if you have 4 shocks on your truck, you will need 2 reservoir kits to put a reservoir on every shock. It's exactly the same for every shock, so I will walk you through how to install it on this one. So here is everything that comes in the kit. We have 2 new shock caps, 2 reservoirs, all the required O-rings. These are the pistons that go inside the reservoir. These close off the bottom of the reservoir, screws, and some springs. So this is everything you need to install 1 reservoir on 1 shock, and the first step is to take this shock cap off and drain the oil. So we can set the cap aside, and I also removed the spring just to make this process a little bit easier. Now when draining the oil, I find it's easiest if you have the shock all the way extended so the piston is all the way at the bottom. And I like to save the oil. It's not entirely necessary, but normally this oil is pretty clear, so it's perfectly fine. If your oil is dirty, you'll definitely want to get new oil, and we sell the shock oil on our website as well. So now with the shock cleaned up, you want to remove this O-ring. I find these little picks are really helpful. Just be sure you don't damage the O-ring. So here I have the O-ring we just removed from the original shock cap. Here's the new shock cap for the reservoir. You're just going to want to simply insert the O-ring into the new cap, and then you're also going to take one of these O-rings, which are the largest O-ring in the reservoir kit. That goes in the top of the reservoir side. And here you can also see these 2 holes. There's actually a passageway here, and then we have a little bleeder screw which we'll install at the end. With this part finished and those 2 O-rings installed, we can move on to the bottom of the reservoir. Here, this cap, we need to add the orange O-ring. It's the only one in the kit, so we just bring this all the way down. There we go. The next step is take the longest screw and this O-ring. It's the second smallest O-ring. We're going to add it onto the screw and then thread it into the bottom of the shock cap. Now this O-ring is here to provide some pressure on the screw and prevent it from backing out. If you really want to, let's say you drive your truck pretty hard, you could add some blue Loctite here, and that will keep the screw in place as well. So this part is all finished for now. Now we can move on to the internal piston. This requires these 2 seals. Now these seals are slightly special. They're actually directional. This is not like a normal O-ring. So the seal, you can see there's a little lip on the very bottom, and we're going to want those lips facing in on this piston. So with those stretched into place, you just want to make sure that they are both facing in. You can see those lips on either of these right here. And with them facing in like this, it will ensure that no matter which direction the piston moves inside the reservoir, it's still sealing the oil. Now you can grab your reservoir, and we're going to add this other large O-ring to the top. The top of the reservoir is the end that has the threads on the outside. You can see there are threads on the inside of the bottom. So it goes like this when it's mounted at the end. So this is the bottom of the reservoir. Next comes this plastic part, which has a small hole in the bottom for the screw. Goes like that. Then we have our spring, which will keep pressure on the piston. So this slides on like this. And then there's the hole. We go like that. And this entire assembly will now go inside of the reservoir. I like to start by pressing the piston into the top of the reservoir. Remember, this is the top, and here we have the threads, that's also the top. So we're going to press this in. You want to do this very gently and not damage the seals. You can also use a little bit of silicone grease, and that will help press everything together. So our spring goes in the bottom there. You want to make sure it seats into the bottom of the piston we just installed. Then we have our little black plastic part, which goes in like this. And then the last part is install the bottom. You just want to make sure that this screw head ends up in that hole of the black part. So we push it all together. You should feel a little bit of pressure from the spring, and then we just thread this on. The orange O-ring will seal any little bit of oil that might be in the bottom. And now the idea of this screw is we can adjust the screw. Right now I have it all the way out, and then as I tighten this in, it's pushing the spring up, which is then giving more pressure on the piston, which more pressure on the piston leads to more pressure on the oil that's inside of the shock. I like to, while I'm installing it, to have the screw all the way backed out, and then I also go in and I just push the piston down as much as I can. Sometimes it's a little hard, but I push it down as much as I can. It's about an inch in there right now. Here you can see that's about how far down my piston is, and that's about as far down as it will go. The last thing to do before we can fill our shock with oil is to install this little bleeder screw. The smallest O-ring just slides on so that it seals the oil, and then it threads in right here. You always want to be careful with any of the threads on our truck that thread into aluminum, as it's easy to strip, and you can of course use Loctite as much as you want on these small parts. Definitely recommend only using blue Loctite. There's really no reason to go any stronger here. So now with our three components assembled, here is the V3 shock. We have the reservoir with all of the O-rings and piston installed, and then we have the new shock cap with our bleeder screw added. We can start filling the shock and reservoir with oil. I like to start with the reservoir and then screw that on and hold it here, and then I fill the shock with oil, and then I screw everything together. So here I'm going to add the oil to the reservoir. I pushed the piston all the way down as much as I could before doing this, and I also have the screw backed out all the way on the bottom, so there's the least amount of pressure on the oil. Now with the oil added, I just screw it into the shock cap. And here you want to tighten it so that we seal against those O-rings, but obviously you don't want to over tighten it, as aluminum threads are really easy to strip out. Now we can start filling the shock with oil. The way I like to fill shocks is I add a very small amount to begin with, maybe about ½ an inch of oil in the bottom of the shock. And then I go in and I will move the piston a little bit and just get out any little bits of bubbles that might be underneath the piston, and then I fill it the rest of the way up. So with our shock full to the top of oil and our reservoir is also full, we can thread the two together. So now with our shock completely full of oil, you'll want to pump it up and down a few times to hopefully get any air out, and to also start moving oil between the reservoir and the shock body. I do this all with the screw backed out all the way. You can see it's flush there. And then what you can do is leave the shock about halfway up, tighten this screw, and you should be pushing that piston up. And what will happen is that's adding pressure to the system, and you should see the piston start to move out. And that means you set this up correctly and you have enough oil in the system. So now with the spring and shock end back on the shock, this is all complete and ready to go and be installed on your truck.